Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 82 of Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast where, with my good friend and colleague Matt Kelly, founder and editor of Radical Compliance, we take a deep dive, literally going into the weeds for a compliance or compliance-related topic each week. This week, we return to Michael Cohen and his consulting company, Essential Consulting. We take a look at it from the compliance perspective. Matt has additional information from what he previously posted last week and what we talked about in our first emergency podcast ever on Compliance Into the Weeds. We consider the AT&T award for its top compliance program by the North Texas Compliance and Ethics Group. We consider the role of Novartis and what they may have intended or not intended, and we analyze things from how you should handle your life cycle of third-party management relationships. We also consider whether this could be a potential FCPA violation on books and records. It's a fascinating continued exploration of the Michael Cohen saga. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back with my good friend and colleague Matt Kelly for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. This is not an emergency podcast. This is actually a regularly scheduled podcast, but it is with what is becoming one of our favorite topics, Michael Cohen. So today we're going to see where the payments were, how the compliance function works around all this. Are there any lessons for the compliance practitioner? Talk about AT&T, Novartis, and some of our new friends. So, Matt, with that introduction, which direction did you want to take us today?
Well, it's funny, Tom. I think this is the first time we have ever had two consecutive podcasts, emergency or otherwise, on the same subject. But when you look at the galling nature of what has happened here with these millions of dollars funneled to Michael Cohen, it's for better or worse, it is a great source of learning material for compliance officers. The first thing that struck me that I discovered late last week, and then I posted something over the weekend, was that last Tuesday, May 8th, the very day that the news broke that Michael Cohen was accepting millions of dollars from large corporations, including about $600,000 from AT&T, all of that funneled into the same shell company he had already been using to pay off that porn actress, Stormy Daniels, for her supposed affair with President Trump. The day that news all broke, earlier that morning, AT&T won a corporate ethics award in what is probably the most epically awkward case of bad timing ever. They were named, the Greater Dallas Business Ethics Award of 2018. That is what AT&T received from the North Texas Ethics Association. They had a very nice luncheon where David Huntley, who was AT&T's senior compliance executive, he accepted the award, and I have a nice photo there. I wanted to talk a little bit about this because, number one, clearly this makes AT&T look bad. It's a terrible case of timing. But number two, it really kind of struck me that this teases out the difference between what we would call control activities and the control environment in a broader system of effective internal control, whether that's for financial reporting or compliance or anything else. But we talk about these terms a lot. And this is a very good example of what they actually mean, because I know some people on AT&T's compliance staff, and I think that they do work hard. I think they like this profession. I think they deserve an award. But all of the work they were doing was compliance activities, the policies rollouts, the checklists that you go through, the vetting of third parties, all the actions. And then all of that was overshadowed by this failure in the control environment where clearly somebody at a senior level at AT&T thought it was a good idea to hire Michael Cohen at inflated prices for supposedly consulting advice and insights, but on very specific policy issues that AT&T was tussling with the Trump administration right then. And this looks like it could align up to being a payoff because Michael Cohen gives payoffs, because Donald Trump is not above engaging in these very transactional things. I am not saying AT&T did pay a bribe to Michael Cohen to be funneled to Donald Trump. I am not saying that, but you see all the pieces are there for that to be inferred by some cynical people. And someone at a senior level should have thought this is going to look bad and this sets a bad precedent. And it, like I said, it overshadows all the other hard work that AT&T probably did deserve for its compliance staff getting that award. And that's been rolling around in my mind since I had that post up over the weekend. So that's the very first thing that struck me. And there's the second wave of news that we have.
So, I guess when I did read your post, and it really took me back to 2015, in September 2015, when I listened to the Harvard Business Review podcast on its award of the world's top CEOs, and Martin Winterkorn was in the top 20. And they had to give a disclaimer that that award was researched and awarded prior to the public dissemination of the emissions testing scandal. So I guess perhaps I had that view of things. Sometimes awkwardness happens. But I guess, Matt, what the other point, though, I drew from your certainly your blog post and even further your remarks is that it's one thing to have a compliance program, but it's another thing to do compliance. And that's really what I saw as a major failure at AT&T. The Department of they call their government affairs external and internal affairs, and that individual who ran that department hastily resigned, no doubt to pursue other opportunities. That department now reports to the general counsel's office. But if we look at it, or I was trying to look at it from the compliance perspective, that if they had actually done compliance, if compliance had been operationalized around the hiring of Cohen, someone would have had to justify that. Someone would have had to look into his abilities and technical skills to deliver on the solutions they were seeking. And then there should have been a second set of eyes on that, someone above the business unit rep, or here the government affairs person, to say, we can do this, but should we do this? And then having an appropriate contract in place and manage that relationship thereafter. And we didn't see really any of that with, I don't think, AT&T, with Novartis, or the Korean aerospace company. So from the compliance perspective, I really drew the lesson from your blog post that it's exactly as you said. It's one thing to have the program in place, but does your control environment actually move forward to operationalize compliance?
You know, what struck me was, as I've said in a couple of posts about Michael Cohen now, is like, if you are a compliance officer, describe all of these elements, but pretend it is a foreign government. So somebody comes to you and says, we have a big contract or a big antitrust litigation going on in this foreign country. We're going to hire the personal attorney of the new president, and we're going to pay him above market rates for his insights, which are really only about the president himself. He has no particular policy expertise on telecom or drug policy, if we want to pick on Novartis instead. But, you know, he's got no particularly relevant subject matter expertise. And so we're going to do this. Now, a compliance officer would not allow that kind of proposal to fly very far if we said it was a foreign government. And let's also remember one other detail, is that the Mueller investigation contacted AT&T in the November-December timeframe. And so clearly, by then, AT&T knew this is odd. And again, let's pretend it's a foreign government where we wanted to work with this consultant. And by the way, the special prosecutor in that country who's investigating the sitting president for possible corruption, they've sent us a subpoena request. But we still want to use this guy. It wouldn't happen if it was a foreign government. Well, it continued to happen with AT&T because The Mueller probe contacted them in November, December. There was another wire transfer that they paid in January of this year. So, like, how many more red flags do you need that this might be a troubling thing? Because it would be nothing but red flag fabric if this was a foreign government. It would be nothing but red everywhere. And yet this proceeded. Now, the only time it did actually stop was that 9 days later, the Wall Street Journal broke the story about the payoff to Stormy Daniels, and now suddenly nobody's giving Michael Cohen any money. It all aligns that you can very easily say once AT&T got caught, they turned it off. But they let it go while there was every sort of concern that in any other context, the chief compliance officer and the whole compliance function would be screaming bloody murder, that it was a dumb idea, because it was a dumb idea. Corruption does not respect national boundaries. What is stinky and corrupt to the human sensibilities in one country is still stinky and corrupt in your home country too. Doesn't matter if the law says it's permissible or not. Actual human beings will look at it and say, this does not pass the smell test. That's where AT&T is. If they want to treat this seriously, if they want to say we are serious about compliance issues, they have to produce a whole lot more documentation to defend the decisions that they made, because they don't make much sense from what we know so far.
So yesterday, Matt, an organization called, see if I can find it, AmericanOversight.org, got through a Freedom of Information Act request a notation of a private dinner that the FCC chairman had with representatives from AT&T prior to the FCC's ruling on net neutrality. This was after AT&T had begun their payments to Cohen. So perhaps that was part of the quid pro quo. I think probably the administration's position on the AT&T merger was contrary to what AT&T had hoped for. But the thing that struck me today was when I read that Novartis had made clear that they found Cohen's was not going to be able to provide the services that they had anticipated, that they contracted for, and they had made a decision not to engage him further. But here's the part that intrigued me, Matt, that I really wanted to explore with you. And this comes from Betty Levine's article in Vanity Fair, where it said that Novartis worried that canceling the contract might anger the president. So if you take it that they understood that the contract would be known to the president, it seems to me that almost backs into really a different purpose for having the contract, which was to gain favor with the president in the first place.
And now let's shift our fire to Novartis, because I have a few shots I want to fire there too. All of that is completely true. Add in the fact that Novartis seemed to be paying Michael Cohen about 10 times as much as its standard lobbyist retainer, which was about $12,000 a month. And they were paying him $120,000 a month for 10 months for $1.2 million. And, getting back to your earlier point about AT&T's chairman, Randall Stevens, meeting with the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, like, seriously, does anybody think that Randall Stevens, chairman of the CEO of the largest telecom company in the country, he couldn't get a private audience with the head of the FCC just by asking? Because I'm pretty sure he could. Or at the very least, he could have, through his normal AT&T paid lobbyists, the government affairs division, where the chief just resigned over this. They did not need Michael Cohen to broker that sort of a meeting. AT&T is a powerful company, and we all know how the levers of power work. Michael Cohen seemed to be an unnecessary part of that machine. And then he received a very large pile of money. Well, what happened to that money? Where did it go? And why would you need an unnecessary part of the machine to have all of this cash for something that AT&T probably could have requested anyways and taken the meeting? So it gives this appearance that there is some sort of compliance for thee, employees, third parties, everybody else, but not for me, the senior executives at Novartis, AT&T, the Korean Airlines, and everyone else. I may let the Korean Airlines off the hook a little bit because it wouldn't surprise me if they don't know what their compliance operations are. I'm not familiar with that company. Korea did have a long history with corruption, much longer than the United States, and I think its compliance programs are probably a bit less mature than where we are. So I'm willing to consider other elements about that, although their reasoning for hiring Michael Cohen for technical accounting services was also is bizarre. Again, when you have a third party, you are supposed to document. Is this third party able to provide the services that it says? Are you paying them a fair market rate commensurate with competitors? Are they actually delivering the services they're contracted for? These are questions that every single company has to ask if they're subject to the books and records requirements of either the FCPA or just general federal securities law. So what's the answer to those questions related to Michael Cohen? Because the guy's a real estate lawyer who dabbles in taxi medallions on the side in New York City. So what expertise could he give? And we need to know that if we want to continue to believe these companies do take compliance seriously.
So it's really too bad that the Korean company didn't hire him in January, because then Cohen could have said he listened to our series on RevRec and was an expert on RevRec. But this was back in 2017 before we'd gotten around to it. So, and the other point I would note that I found out today was that even Uber refused to hire Michael Cohen. So, what does it say when, and this is when Travis Kalanick was still CEO. So what does it say? So the other thing, Matt, and you really hit it on it with Novartis, but Jason Meyer raised in a tweet last week about the question of fair market value, and goes directly to your point on Novartis paying 10 times its average payment to lobbyists. And what is fair market value? And if you do have such an extraordinarily higher payment to a consultant for these types of services, shouldn't there be an audit trail which would justify that extraordinary payment? And so I really thought about it in terms of really what's fair market value. Certainly you can pay higher than fair market value for a true subject matter expert, but you really detailed what it appears that Mr. Cohen's true subject matter expertise is in, although once again, Betty Levine did entitle her piece, Michael Cohen must be the most gifted consultant in America. So, so now let me turn to the next step, Matt, in the process, because we've talked about sort of the business justification. We've talked about a questionnaire. We've talked about due diligence. And then I even found some interesting thoughts around the contract. So you and I both do work as independent contractors. Certainly, I probably had more experience drafting agreements than yourself. But in every contract I've ever drafted, there's a material breach clause, which says if you materially breach this contract or fail to perform, it can be terminated, sometimes without notice, but at the very least with notice and opportunity to cure. So where was that clause? Where was the compliance terms and conditions that we would typically see? Perhaps not FCPA, but at least a certification that we're not going to break any laws here, and that we would adhere to your supplier code of conduct. That is almost standard now. If you don't have your own code of conduct, did anybody look at the formation of this company, how long it had been around, any references, any of the standard things, and then really the managing of the relationship afterwards. And I would have to say, Matt, that as a former transactional lawyer, finding out that your subject matter expert had no expertise in the subject matter after you sign the contract is one of the most unusual things that I've ever seen in a strict business relationship.
Yeah, I mean, all of this is true. And, so I think people probably should just call a spade and say that, Michael Cohen really just looks like a grifter here trying to capitalize on his connections to the president. it looks like he either duped a whole lot of companies, or the companies were just kowtowed and kind of browbeaten and saying, well, we can't not do this. Clearly, other companies thought, yes, we can take a pass on this because Ford and Uber did. It is not like either of them don't have pressing issues in front of the federal government. Of course they do, but they knew that this third party, Michael Cohen, he did not pass the smell test. I am intrigued about Stormy Daniels' lawyer, Michael Avenatti, who continues to keep the world entertained with whatever information he's getting here. So far, it's proving to be accurate. We still don't know where all of the first chunk of millions came from for Michael Cohen. We don't know if there are other shells. We don't know if there's other money. Michael Avenatti is saying that he will have more information shortly about all of this, and we could see maybe other companies trying to squirm their way out of some very unflattering, unpleasant spotlights. But really, it gets back to what I said earlier about this AT&T awards dinner, that it's the difference between the compliance activities, which are all of these nuts and bolts things that most people listening to this podcast, most of you do on a daily basis. And it can be tedious, it can be exhausting, but it is for a purpose, versus the compliance environment, the control environment that really is set by these CEOs, senior executives, general counsels, the boards, that tone at the top. And when something like this happens, that probably either evaded the compliance program or ignored the compliance program or overrode the objections, all of those things, all the activities go out in the wash once that tone at the top sets such a sour environment. And that's what's happened here with AT&T. It is a shame, because I'm willing to bet almost all the compliance staff had no idea that this Michael Cohen thing was in their orbit at all, let alone that it would ruin their day and their ethics award.
Well, Matt, I think we're going to get to explore this topic perhaps even on another podcast.
I would not be surprised.
Do you have any sneak peeks on any blog posts you have coming out with more of your thoughts?
I will eventually get to discussing the difference between compliance activities and or control activities and the control environment, because I think it's important to know. I think compliance officers should go and tell their boards and CEOs, this is why you really have to be serious about the tone at the top, because if this stuff happens at our company, it's going to ruin everything else that you've tried to say about compliance before. So I'm going to have a post at some point about that. But I think, it's a great teachable moment to tell boards and CEOs, like, you can't pay lip service to this stuff. When you slip up on tone at the top, it just looks awful. And so this does.
Well, Matt, I look forward to that next blog post, and I look forward to our next podcast.
Thank you, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you again for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. If you have any questions on the topic of this podcast, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Matt at mkelly@radicalcompliance.com. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast. That would help in our rankings and getting the word out about the only weekly podcast that takes a deep dive, literally going into the weeds around compliance. Thanks again for listening to this episode. I hope you'll join us again next week for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.